picture a startup pitch for a moment. Just imagine you're sitting there. Usually you know exactly how this goes, right?
Yeah. The classic boardroom scene.
Exactly. A founder walks into a boardroom, fires up a slide deck, and they want to, I don't know, disrupt food delivery. Or maybe they're pitching like a new software platform for mid-level managers.
Yeah, the typical B2B SaaS playbook.
Right. And they are looking for a few $1 million, aiming for a nice, clean exit
Yeah.
and capturing, a tiny fraction of an existing market.
Right, which is the standard Silicon Valley model.
Yeah.
I mean, the stakes are highly contained, the risks are modeled out, and the ambitions are just strictly commercial.
But imagine a founder walking into that exact same room and just blowing that entire model to pieces.
Like completely throwing out the rule book.
Yeah, they stand up and say, look, our product isn't an app. Our product is the raw physical infrastructure of the future. Right. We aren't asking for capital to build software. We're asking for the capital to lay thousands of miles of high-voltage lines, build gigawatt server farms, and single-handedly drag a developing nation's GDP up by 300%.
That is, I mean, that's not a standard startup pitch.
It's really not.
That is practically a bloodless coup.
Exactly. And today, for this deep dive, we actually have the blueprint for one.
We really do.
Yeah,
And it's fascinating. I mean, the source material we're unpacking today for you is unlike any business plan I have ever seen.
Yeah, tell us a bit about where this comes from.
So it comes from a 2026 blog called Democracy for Nepal.
Yeah.
And it outlines this 10-year manifesto, basically a roadmap for a project called Himalayan Compute.
Okay.
And what makes this document so riveting is that the author isn't, they aren't sweating over finding customers or figuring out product market fit.
Right, the usual startup anxieties.
Exactly. Instead, they're presenting this absolute structural masterclass in how to overcome deeply entrenched bureaucracy, bypass foreign aid dependency, and essentially build the modern world from scratch.
It really reads like a science fiction epic. I mean, I kept thinking of Dune while I was going through your notes on this.
Oh, Dune is a great comparison.
Right, because in Dune, whoever controls the spice controls the entire universe. Because the spice is that one singular resource that makes space travel possible.
Right, the essential raw material.
Yeah. But in this manifesto, the startup isn't mining spice. They are building compute-like, the raw processing power that allows the entire 21st century global economy to function.
Yeah.
And the planet they want to transform isn't Arrakis, it's Nepal.
The Dune analogy is incredibly fitting, actually, because the whole manifesto hinges entirely on this idea that compute is the definitive resource of our era.
The absolute foundation.
Exactly. The author explicitly calls compute the new oil, but they add this very specific, honestly terrifying caveat.
Which is what?
Unlike oil, the demand for compute is bottomless.
That's a huge distinction. Let's unpack that premise for a second, because when the average person hears compute or the cloud, it sounds like this, I don't know, ephemeral, magical thing floating in the sky.
Right, like it's just Wi-Fi.
Yeah. But the text makes it clear we are talking about something intensely physical, right?
It is entirely physical. The cloud is actually millions of physical servers. And they're housed in these massive concrete warehouses just churning through electricity and generating enormous amounts of heat.
So it's heavy industry.
Absolutely. Compute is the physical engine of the digital world. And the author goes on to list what this engine is currently powering. It is no longer just hosting websites or storing your smartphone photos.
Right. The stakes are way higher now.
Much higher. It's the backbone for training massive AI models. It powers real-time processing for autonomous vehicles, biotech labs, running, complex protein folding simulations for cancer drugs,
Wow.
even national-scale cybersecurity and military intelligence.
So basically, if a technology is advancing human civilization right now, it requires massive, relentless amounts of compute.
Without exception. The text argues that if oil defined the geopolitical hierarchy of the 20th century, compute is the sole metric that will define the 21st.
That's a bold claim.
It is, but look at the global AI arms race between the US, China, the EU, and the Gulf states. Their constraint isn't a lack of ideas.
Right.
And it certainly isn't a lack of capital. The absolute bottleneck right now is the physical capacity to supply the processing power.
They just can't plug things in fast enough.
Exactly. The world literally cannot build data centers, secure the land, and generate the electricity fast enough to keep up with the algorithms currently being designed.
Okay, I want to push back on that oil metaphor for a second, just for you, the listener, to ponder. Because if compute is the new oil, does that make a data center the new oil, Derek?
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Well, think about it. Oil is a finite resource. You pump it, you burn it, and eventually the well runs dry. Furthermore, oil historically creates geographical hostages, right? Entire nations are just at the mercy of the geographic luck of who happens to have oil reserves buried under their sand.
Yes, totally an accident of geography.
But compute, theoretically, scales infinitely as long as you have power and microchips. So, does the author address whether we are looking at a resource with entirely different economic physics?
The author absolutely leans into those different economic physics. That is exactly why they frame Himalayan Compute as an unprecedented opportunity for a nation like Nepal.
Because it's not geographically locked.
Right. You don't have to win the geological lottery to have compute. You just have to be visionary enough to build the infrastructure to host it.
I see.
Because compute is infinitely scalable, it doesn't suffer from resource depletion. The text uses this brilliant phrase, actually, calling the project an industrial revolution packaged as a startup.
An industrial revolution package as a startup. I love that.
It's powerful, right? It isn't about extracting a natural resource and shipping it away. It's about creating an intellectual and physical gravity, well, right inside your own borders.
Okay, that really makes it tangible. But if the demand is bottomless and the stakes are literally the balance of global technological power,
Which they are.
that raises a massive question. Who should actually build this? Because my first instinct, and I assume the instinct of anyone who thinks about national scale power grids and international tech supremacy, is that this is a job for a sovereign government.
Well, the manifesto attacks that exact instinct with absolute ferocity.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The author is adamant.
Yeah.
Himalayan Compute is not a U.S. government project. It is not a foreign aid initiative. And it absolutely should not be driven by state diplomats.
So no federal grants, no USCD.
None of it. It must be built with private capital, private urgency, and private ambition.
Let's talk about the specific historical comparison the text uses, because I know the author mercilessly mocks the delusion of waiting for governments to build the future.
They do. There is this deeply cynical line where the founder compares waiting for the government to build this infrastructure to the absurdity of Steve Bannon proposing the nationalization of SpaceX.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty sharp. The author uses what they call the SpaceX model to explain how true innovation actually happens.
Unpack that SpaceX model for us.
So there's this massive public misconception that NASA somehow birthed SpaceX.
Right, like they incubated it.
Exactly. But the roadmap points out the historical reality, which is that NASA did not build SpaceX's rockets.
What did they do then?
What NASA did through their commercial orbital transportation services contracts was become SpaceX's most important early customer.
So government wasn't the architect, government was the anchor tenant.
That is a vital distinction. Governments generally do not build paradigm-shifting unicorns.
No, they don't.
What governments do is regulate them, tax them, buy from them, and, as the text dryly notes, sometimes accidentally suffocate them.
Right, through red tape.
Exactly. To build something at the bleeding edge, you need founders who are willing to take massive personal and financial risks, move at breakneck speed, and completely ignore what the author calls permission culture.
Permission culture.
Yeah, you just cannot innovate if you have to wait for a committee hearing every single time you want to pour concrete.
But hold on, let me play the skeptic here.
Sure.
Isn't it incredibly arrogant for a startup to assume it can move faster than a sovereign state on something that is fundamentally national infrastructure?
It sounds arrogant, yeah.
I mean, we aren't talking about coding a new messaging app in a Stanford dorm room. We are talking about acquiring massive tracts of sovereign land, securing gigawatts of hydroelectric power, and negotiating international fiber optic lines across actual borders.
Yes, physical reality.
Right. Can pure, concentrated private ambition really bulldoze through all of those physical, legal, and geopolitical realities without the government holding the steering wheel?
Well, the author acknowledges the friction there, but they argue that the alternative, waiting for government grants or diplomatic initiatives, is just a guaranteed death sentence for the project.
Because it'll just stall out.
Exactly. The text explicitly states that this is not a grant proposal disguised as a business plan.
Okay.
It is a harsh, structural critique of the dependency mindset that plagues a lot of developing nations.
So it's basically saying, stop waiting to be saved.
Exactly. The argument is that if you want something to exist on a global scale, you do not sit around waiting for Washington or the World Bank or foreign aid agencies to build it for you. You secure private capital, you take the risk, and you build it yourself.
That feels like a complete paradigm shift for how developing nations operate. Historically, countries like Nepal have relied heavily on foreign aid, NGOs, and massive international loans for infrastructure.
It absolutely challenges that foundation. The manifesto suggests that waiting for external saviors is fundamentally flawed because it just breeds complacency and corruption.
Right.
True development, in this view, doesn't come from begging for help. It comes from creating an asset of undeniable, indispensable global value and selling it to the world.
So you stop being a charity case and you become a critical supplier.
Perfectly said.
Okay, so the startup has to build it. They bring the private speed and they bring the private capital.
Right.
But as you said, they are still operating within Nepal's physical borders. They still need that land, that power, that fiber, which means eventually this fast-moving Silicon Valley-style startup has to collide with the local government.
Yes, inevitably.
And that seems like a recipe for a catastrophic collision of two very, very different operating speeds.
That collision isn't just a risk. The founder identifies it as the single biggest bottleneck to the entire project.
Not the tech, not the money.
Nope. Interestingly, the text points out that raising the capital isn't the real hurdle. It specifically mentions that raising billions from the Gulf states like the UAE, for example, is entirely feasible right now.
Because they have so much sovereign wealth.
Exactly. Gulf sovereign wealth funds are actively hunting for massive, future-facing global projects. They know oil is finite, and they desperately want a dominant stake in the AI and compute revolution.
So money is not the object. If you have the vision, the Gulf has the checkbook.
Exactly. The true enemy, according to the roadmap, is the Nepali bureaucracy itself.
Ah.
The author describes this dynamic vividly. Bureaucrats have the terrifying power to destroy a billion-dollar, nation-changing dream simply by losing a stamp.
Wow.
They don't even have to openly oppose the project. They don't have to pass a law against it. They can just suffocate the innovation with silence, with endless paperwork, with a permanent chorus of "come back next week."
That phrase used in the text, corruption by delay, is just haunting.
It really is.
It perfectly captures how stagnation is weaponized.
It's a brilliant articulation of a systemic disease. The text contrasts the two environments. If the Gulf is a desert overflowing with future-focused capital, Nepal's bureaucracy is a swamp full of invisible traps.
Right, because outright theft or bribery is one thing. You can model for that in a budget, honestly.
It's a known cost.
But the slow, grinding, unpredictable friction of an inefficient state apparatus is much deadlier to a startup. Because startups survive entirely on momentum, and bureaucracy survives entirely on stasis.
That's the core conflict right there.
So, if the swamp is the ultimate boss fight, how do they defeat it? Because this brings us to what I consider the most radical, mind-bending structural innovation in the entire business plan.
Oh, this is the best part.
To solve the bureaucracy problem, the founder proposes giving a flat 10% ownership of this potentially trillion-dollar company directly to the government of Nepal.
But the text is very, very careful to clarify the exact nature of this 10%.
Right, it's not a gift.
No, it is not a bribe to look the other way. It is not a philanthropic donation,
Right.
and it is certainly not a symbolic gesture of patriotism. It is a hard-nosed, strategic corporate exchange.
Okay, so what are they getting for it?
They are trading 10% equity for a very specific, uncompromising type of governance.
They call it the one-desk policy.
Yes, the strict condition for that 10% equity is the establishment of a single one-desk command center, and it has to be physically located inside the Prime Minister's office.
I love this concept. And the best way for you to visualize this is through software. It is exactly like the startup is building an API and application programming interface for an entire country's government.
It really is.
Think about how the apps on your phone work. If you open Instagram, the app doesn't manually negotiate with your phone's camera hardware, then write separate code to talk to your microphone, and then manually ping your GPS chip.
That would be absurdly slow.
Right. It just sends a single request to your phone's operating system via an API, and the operating system handles all the complex routing, permissions, and hardware checks in the background.
The manifesto actually uses a very similar technical metaphor. It states that the Prime Minister's office must become the motherboard, and the individual government ministries become mere plug-in components.
Okay, so under this plan, instead of the startup's founders manually knocking on 20 different agonizingly slow ministry boars. The Ministry of Energy for Power, the Ministry of Land for Zoning, Customs for importing servers, Immigration for engineering visas.
Right, getting stuck at every single door.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of that, they just plug into this one single desk in the PM's office. They say, here is what we need to hit our Q3 infrastructure goals. And that one desk handles all the bureaucratic routing, interdepartmental fighting, and approvals in the background.
It forces the country to stop acting like an unnavigable maze and start acting like a highly efficient machine.
Look, I have to stop you there and play devil's advocate again.
Go for it.
Because this API analogy sounds beautiful on paper. Giving the government 10% to speed things up makes logical sense. But isn't this just institutionalizing bribery at the highest possible level?
That's a very common reaction.
Right. I mean, how does handing equity to the top of a historically corrupt bureaucracy magically make the whole system clean? Won't the lower-level guys at the customs office or the land registry still demand their cut? Or drag their feet because they aren't personally seeing that 10%?
Well, that is the exact vulnerability this structure is trying to bypass.
How so?
The author's theory is that by giving the sovereign government a massive equity stake, the government's own financial upside becomes directly tied to the raw speed and success of the company.
So they have skin in the game.
Exactly. It elevates the payoff. Suddenly, the prime minister has a multi-billion-dollar reason to ensure those permits get approved today.
Oh, I see.
Right? So if a lower-level customs official holds up a shipment of servers to extract a $1,000 bribe, they aren't just hurting a foreign startup. They are actively damaging the valuation of the prime minister's 10% stake.
Oh, wow. That changes the dynamic entirely.
It transforms the executive branch from a passive regulator into a highly motivated, aggressive partner that will police its own lower ranks to protect its equity.
That is wild. Okay, so you've built this brilliant API for the government. You've aligned the incentives at the very top.
Right.
But an API is useless if the underlying operating system refuses to run it. And historically, Nepal's political operating system has actively resisted this kind of aggressive modernization.
Oh, fiercely resisted it.
So how does this manifesto address the people currently in power? Does the author actually believe the political culture is ready for this?
Well, the author believes there is a very narrow, very specific window of opportunity right now.
Yeah.
The roadmap isn't just presented as a sterile business document. The author explicitly calls it a political salute.
To who?
Specifically, it is a salute to Nepal's Gen Z revolution.
Right. The author pins all their hopes on the current political shift, highlighting one specific figure, Prime Minister Balan.
They do. The text frames Balan not just as a politician, but as a generational disruptor. The author describes him as someone who represents a violent break from the past, a leader who values raw competence over deeply entrenched caste networks, and ruthless execution over endless, flowery political speeches.
So he's the operating system update.
Exactly. The author sees this new, youth-driven administration as the only environment impatient enough and execution-focused enough to actually implement something as radical as the one-desk policy.
But let's maintain some distance here. Can one bold Gen Z-backed leader really dismantle centuries of deeply entrenched patronage systems?
It's a huge ask.
I mean, bureaucracies have an incredible immune system. They have a way of outlasting reformers.
The manifesto doesn't underestimate the difficulty of that fight. In fact, the author includes a profound sociological anecdote about exactly how deep this resistance goes, and it doesn't just apply to people living within Nepal's borders.
Yes, the story from New York, this was absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah, the founder shares a story from back in 2005 and 2006, when they were actively working for Nepal's democracy movements while living in New York City.
Right.
And the founder describes meeting older Nepalists who had lived in the United States for decades. These were people residing in the heart of one of the world's most aggressive capitalist democracies.
Living the American dream, basically.
Right. They were enjoying all the economic benefits, the legal protections, and the infrastructure of an open system. Yet when asked about the political situation back home, they remained actively opposed to democratic movements in Nepal.
That is just, it's wild to think about. And the takeaway the founder highlights is chilling. They write, democracy is not contagious.
It is a devastating observation about human nature and systemic change.
Yeah.
It destroys the idea of cultural osmosis.
Yeah.
That comforting assumption that if people just spend enough time in developed, forward-thinking nations, they will automatically internalize those values and bring them back home.
Right. That physical travel just naturally broadens the mind.
But the text asserts that physical travel does not equal mental travel. You can benefit from an open system every single day while mentally and emotionally defending a closed, oppressive system back home.
So the biggest competitor for Himalayan Compute isn't Google or Amazon Web Services or Microsoft.
Not at all. The real enemy, as stated in the text, is old Nepal.
Old Nepal.
Yeah. It is a deeply entrenched psychological culture where ambition is treated with intense suspicion, where big ideas are actively punished simply for being big, and where the default state of governance is resistance to change.
So the one desk policy is an open declaration of war on that old system.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay, so if they somehow rewrite the operating system, if they defeat the bureaucratic swamp and actually build this massive infrastructure, what is the actual reward?
The payoff.
Right, because the economic prize, the roadmap projects, is almost difficult to comprehend.
It's massive. The text claims that if Himalayan Compute is executed correctly, Nepal could experience historic triple-digit economic growth rates for several consecutive years.
Just astronomical numbers.
We are talking about expanding the gross domestic product by 300%.
Which sounds like hyperbole until you look at the historical precedents they provide. They point out that this explosion in wealth is exactly what happens when a small, overlooked economy suddenly becomes a major supplier of a high-demand global commodity.
It's happened before. The text cites several powerful examples. It mentions Estonia, a tiny post-Soviet state that birthed Skype, digitized its entire government, and became a global tech powerhouse.
Right.
It mentions Ireland, which utilized aggressive tax structures to become the European headquarters for global tech giants. It mentions Dubai, which transformed itself from a desert outpost into a global logistics and finance hub.
All great examples.
But the most potent comparison it draws is to Taiwan.
I really want to dig deeply into the Taiwan comparison because it is the most structurally similar to what we were talking about here. Taiwan didn't just stumble into being the semiconductor capital of the world.
Exactly. Taiwan's dominance in semiconductors wasn't an accident of geography. It was a deliberate, brutal act of national strategy.
Yeah, right.
Decades ago, the Taiwanese government recognized that they needed an economic shield. So they created the Industrial Technology Research Institute to foster innovation, but they knew the government couldn't build a global business.
Right, they knew their limits.
So they recruited Morris Chang, put private capital to work, and spun out TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company.
Okay.
They provided the infrastructure, the talent pipeline, and the capital, but allowed it to operate with ruthless private efficiency.
And it worked.
Boy, did it. Today, TSMC is so vital to the global economy that it acts as Taiwan's silicon shield against invasion.
And the argument in the manifesto is that Nepal could execute the exact same playbook, but instead of semiconductors, they have compute.
Yes. And the author asserts that compute is actually far more valuable than any of those historical examples.
Why is that?
Well, Skype revolutionized communication, semiconductors revolutionized hardware, but compute is the foundational layer for artificial intelligence, which is actively reshaping every single industry on Earth simultaneously.
It's crucial to understand that this isn't just about the money made by renting out server space, though. It's about what happens around that server space.
Yeah.
The text uses this incredible term, the economic gravity well.
It's a great concept. When you place a massive, world-class compute hub in a developing country, it inherently exerts a massive economic pull. The cascading effects alter the fundamental fabric of the nation.
Because it's not just the servers.
Exactly. Just to power these data centers, you have to trigger massive infrastructure development.
Right. You can't just plug a gigawatt server farm into a standard city grid. You need to build high voltage power lines. You need advanced industrial scale cooling systems. You need specialized construction firms that know how to build secure, climate-controlled environments.
All of which creates high-paying, highly technical jobs.
Yeah.
And when those jobs appear, it triggers a massive reversal of the brain drain. The diaspora, the brilliant Nepali engineers working in Silicon Valley, London, or Bangalore, suddenly have a financial and professional reason to return home.
Because the cutting edge is back home.
Exactly. To sustain that talent pool long-term, new universities and specialized training ecosystems have to emerge. And because proximity to compute provides a slight latency advantage for AI companies, you start seeing a secondary boom of software startups clustering physically around the compute hub.
Here's how I picture this economic gravity well working in practice. It's like building a massive futuristic anchor store in the middle of an abandoned, failing shopping mall.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Think about it. Before the anchor store arrives, nobody wants to open a shop there. There's no foot traffic, there's no security, the lighting is bad.
Right, it's a ghost town.
But the second you drop a massive high-end anchor store into that space, it creates artificial gravity.
Mm.
Suddenly, specialty boutiques want to open next door just to catch the foot traffic.
Yeah, they feed off the energy.
And then the city is forced to upgrade the roads and bus lines leading to the mall. Cafes and restaurants open up just to feed the construction workers and the new employees. The arrival of the anchor store forces the entire surrounding ecosystem to upgrade itself.
That is the exact mechanism of infrastructure-led development. The text argues that Himalayan Compute is the anchor store for Nepal's 21st century.
It changes everything.
It changes the local schools, it skyrockets real estate values, it forces the telecommunications networks to upgrade to world-class fiber, and perhaps most importantly, it fundamentally changes the psychological ambitions of the youth.
Because they can see a future.
Right. They suddenly see a path to global relevance that doesn't require them to buy a plane ticket and leave their home country forever.
So let's assume the anchor store is built. Trillions of dollars of global capital are flowing in. The gravity well is functioning perfectly.
Your best case scenario.
Right. Which brings us to the most vital question of all. Where does all that generated wealth actually go?
The million, or rather trillion-dollar question.
Because historically, in these developing nation megaprojects, the wealth just enriches the Silicon Valley founders, the foreign Gulf investors, and the top tier of the local government. The actual citizens rarely see a dime.
This is where the manifesto takes its final, most revolutionary turn. It completely redesigns the corporate cap table to address that exact problem.
Wait, for those of us who aren't swimming in startup funding every day, what exactly is a cap table and why is it so hard to bake philanthropy into it?
Sure. A cap table, or capitalization table, is simply the official legal document that breaks down exactly who owns what percentage of a startup.
Okay, so it's a pie chart of ownership.
Exactly. It lists the founders, the investors, the employees, and the exact equity they hold. The reason it is so hard to bake philanthropy into it on day one is that traditional investors want maximum returns.
Right, they want the whole pie.
If you give away chunks of the company to charity, the investors' potential profits are diluted. But the author of this manifesto does exactly that. The corporate architecture includes a second, non-negotiable 10% equity carve-out.
Okay, so the first 10% went to the government in exchange for the one-desk policy.
Correct. The second 10% of the entire company will be irrevocably owned by a foundation.
A foundation.
Yes. And the source material is explicitly clear about the sole singular purpose of this foundation. It does not exist to run awareness campaigns. It exists to engineer direct cash transfers to the poorest 20% of Nepal's population,
Direct cash transfers.
with the stated mathematical goal of eliminating extreme poverty.
Just raw cash, not building a school, not digging a well, not donating laptops, just giving raw cash directly to the poorest citizens.
Exactly.
How does handing out cash systemically eliminate poverty without just causing massive local inflation? And why did the founders choose direct cash over traditional infrastructure like hospitals or schools?
It is a deliberate rejection of traditional paternalistic aid models. The text mocks what it calls symbolic CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Like the classic charity gala.
Exactly. It rejects charity dinners, photo ops with sacks of rice, and NGOs that spend 80% of their budgets on administrative overhead.
Well, the overhead is always crazy.
It really is.
Yeah.
The economic theory behind direct cash transfers is that poverty is not a lack of character or a lack of knowledge. Poverty is simply a lack of cash.
It's that simple.
When you give poor individuals direct capital, they don't generally waste it. Studies show they buy tin roofs, they start small farming businesses, they pay for their children's local school fees. It empowers local agency.
Because they know what they need better than an NGO does.
Exactly. And because the capital is distributed broadly across the poorest 20%, rather than dumped into a single market sector, it creates a massive multiplier effect in the local economy, stimulating grassroots business without triggering hyperinflation.
Fusing Silicon Valley hyperscale with this kind of moral urgency is incredibly rare. But I have to ask how the investment world reacts to this.
It's definitely a hard sell in some rooms.
I mean, if you walk onto Sand Hill Road, the street in California where all the biggest venture capital firms are based, and say, I'm giving away 20% of the company before we even start, don't they just laugh you out of the room? VC firms usually demand maximum undiluted returns.
If you pitch a standard software company, yes, they laugh you out of the room.
Right.
But remember the scale of what we are discussing. This is a sovereign-level infrastructure play, and the capital might be coming from Gulf states or sovereign wealth funds. Investors at that level understand geopolitical risk.
Oh, so they view it differently.
They might view a 20% total equity dilution, 10% to align the government, and 10% to pacify and uplift the population as an entirely acceptable, even brilliant tax for gaining access to the market and ensuring absolute political stability.
Ah, it's stability insurance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As the saying goes, 80% of a trillion-dollar company is vastly better than 100% of a project that dies in a bureaucratic committee.
80% of a trillion is better than 100% of a project that dies in committee. That is the mathematics of structural innovation right there.
It really is.
And the founder makes a very personal, revealing statement in the text about this foundation. They admit that without this feature, without the direct poverty elimination hard-coded into the business, their motivation would collapse.
That confession elevates the entire project from a mere business venture to a profound calling.
Yeah, it changes the tone entirely.
Building a massive compute empire is intellectually and financially stimulating, but building a compute empire specifically designed to engineer the permanent end of extreme poverty in a developing nation, that provides a completely different kind of psychological fuel for the founders.
It's a legacy.
Yes. It proves that you can merge the ruthless speed and efficiency of private capitalism with national coordination and a genuine social revolution.
Let's take a breath and synthesize this incredible journey we've just been on. We started with the concept of compute as the bottomless new oil, the indispensable, infinitely scalable physical resource of the 21st century.
We examined the dangers of relying on government saviors or foreign aid, leaning instead into the aggressive private SpaceX model, where the state acts as a customer rather than a builder.
Right. And then we looked at the immense cultural shift required to defeat the invisible traps of old Nepal and the brilliant mechanism designed to do it, trading 10% equity for a one-desk policy API to bypass the bureaucratic swamp.
We explored the economic gravity this compute hub would create, drawing parallels to Taiwan's semiconductor supremacy and Estonia's digital revolution.
And finally, we unpacked a revolutionary corporate architecture that hard-codes a 10% foundation designed to systematically eliminate poverty through direct, empowering cash transfers.
It really all distills down to a specific, profound realization from the text. Innovation isn't only technical, it's structural.
I love that quote.
It's so true, though. We spend so much of our time obsessing over faster microchips, more complex AI parameters, or more efficient liquid cooling systems. But the greatest, most world-altering breakthroughs of our time might not be the technologies themselves. The real breakthroughs might be how we fundamentally restructure the organizations and the incentives that build those technologies. Himalayan Compute is presenting a developing nation with a stark binary choice. Radically alter your structure to enable the future, or watch the future pass you by while you drown in paperwork.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Take a hard look around at the systemic, stubborn problems in your own country, your own city, or even your own industry. How many of those persistent, agonizing crises are waiting, not for some magical new technological invention to fall from the sky, but for a radical new corporate architecture to solve them? Are we trapped in invisible prisons of our own making simply because we haven't dared to redesign the underlying rules of the game?